So it's part 3 today, because we wanted to make sure we spent time in actually going through the scriptures. So I will talk through briefly with no questions. I'll just fill in the front part so we can kind of get us all back on the same page again, and then we'll proceed through with our passages out of Colossians and passage out. See where various people have made mistakes in misunderstanding you, and how the greater body has brought and kept the confession of the church in line with the scriptures and helped us to understand those things that are so most important. Our confession of you is very important. For what we believe about you is who you are. And so we want to make sure our belief aligns with who you actually are. So Lord, I ask you to continue to shape us, mold us, that we would understand you clearer, and that we would be better reflections of your character on the earth in which we walk. In your holy name I pray, Lord Jesus. Amen. Okay, so we are picking up with, continuing our series, Superheroes Can't Save You. In each of those categories, as we deal with the different area, we pick up a various comic book character to help with the memory device aspect. So for Arianism, we used the comic book character Thor as opposed to the mythological figure Thor. We're using the Marvel's version of Thor. So in Marvel's version of Thor, he is created, he is birthed. Thor is birthed through a union between his father Odin and his mother Gaia. And so, but there was a time in the Marvel history that Thor did not exist, that he at some point started his existence and was part of the known world. And so so Arianism is kind of making that argument, that Arius argued that there was a time that he did not exist, or the chant was there was a time that he was not. So in other words, there was a time that Jesus was not created. So in the end, what is Arianism? Arianism says that Christ is created. And this is the error that we're going to refute today, is that and continue to build through the scriptures, that Arius was incorrect and was wrong in this assessment. Did he develop this in a vacuum? No. There were several other theologians that came before him that kind of led to this development, and some other errors that were, so he just kind of swung the pendulum, and he ended up, but then he also dug his heels in and said, no, this is really what we should believe. And so it became much more of a controversial and near church splitting issue during this time period. So our major players of the day were the AAAs, right? So the major players was Alexander of Alexandria. He was the bishop of the city of Alexandria in Egypt. And then you had Arius. And then we also had, Athanasius. There you go. Arius, Athanasius, and Alexander. Alexander was the bishop. He was the kind of the senior elder in charge of the region, and especially of the city of Alexandria, Egypt. Arius was a presbyter. Now, whether he was an elder or simply as a local church pastor, it's unclear. But the way he's described is presbyter, which, if we were to use the definition we have today, that would just be elder. All right. But he was a senior instructor, teacher, pastor in Alexandria. And then Athanasius came in later, after Arius has been on the scene for a little bit. But Athanasius came in and became the secretary of Alexander. In other words, Alexander was grooming Athanasius to replace him at some point. Understand that in this process, Arius wanted to be bishop of Alexandria. He wanted Alexander's job. And when Athanasius came on the scene, He had competition. Up to that point, he had no competition. He would be the likely person. Now, honorable mention. Now, these guys. Sorry, let's take a step back. These guys were basically the late 200s to the early 300s. Because remember, the Council of Nicaea was 325. So late 200s into the early 300s. So end of 3rd century going into the 4th century, that's these guys. The honorable mention is a guy named Origen. Oops. And he was from the early 200s. And so he had already passed away by the time all this came to a head. But at the Council of Nicaea, you had 3 parties. You had those who said that Christ has always existed forever and ever. That was the position of Athanasius and Alexander. And then you had the position that, no, Christ is a created being. He's the first of all created beings. He is God's Son, and all that we see is created through him, but he is a created being. That is the argument of Arius. Origen said, no, Christ is not created. Christ has always and ever been, but he is a degree less than the Father. He is subordinate in his divinity to the Father. So that they are both gods, or God, but in his personhood, he is deficient in comparison to the Father. All right? And so the Council of Nicaea addressed Origen, saying that they are co-equal. What does it say? Being of one substance with the Father, by whom all things were made. The Council of Chalcedon. Our Lord Jesus Christ, once complete in Godhead and complete in manhood, truly God and truly man, consisting also of a reasonable soul and body, of one substance with the Father, as regards his Godhead, and at times one substance with us, as regards his manhood, begotten of the Father before all ages, yet as regards his manhood, begotten for us and for us men, that he is co-equal, co-eternal, without division, that he is on equal standing with the Father. And so you got Origen, who definitely still has influence, but then the big decision, the winner out of the Nicene Council was the Athanasian party, or Alexandrian party, if you will. And so, who? No. Way different Alexander. We're several centuries beyond him at this point. So Bishop Alexander, he was just named Alexander. He was in the city of Alexandria. The city was named after Alexander the Great under his conquests. That's why there's multiple Alexandrias throughout the ancient world, because he'd just go through and then conquer a city and rename it after himself. And Alexandria's spread from Egypt all the way out to Mongol. So most of the ones in China and Mongol right now have all been renamed back to some kind of local dialect. They're no longer called Alexandria. Alexander the Great was not born in 336 BC.
Oh, BC. Oh, big difference.
Yeah. So, because by this time Rome is in charge. Because remember, you have the Emperor Constantine, who is the Roman ruler who oversees and officiates. He sat at the head of the table for the Council of Nicaea, right? So we've moved. So you get that. But Alexander's come up all the time. There's a couple other names that come up. We got to be careful which person we're talking about for various people, because there's another Origen that's out there. We got to be careful we talk about the right one. There's several Clements. There's a great writer, and then there's a guy who just existed. His name was Clement as well. But so you get several of those. Who commits? So in the end, Athanasius and Alexander won the day. And out of the confession, out of the Nicene Creed, we have that, which said that Christ has always existed. He's truly God. He's truly man, in all respects. That he is not created, but begotten. And we're going to talk about what we mean by begotten when we get into these texts over here. So out of this, so in the end, like I said, Athanasius kind of won the day. And that became the position. And what that really led to was the Trinitarian orthodoxy is what came out of Nicaea. It's like we understand God as we can understand him in the idea of Trinity, that he is united, one God, yet eternally existent as three subsistences, three persons, three personae, as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. An existence that is entirely alien to ours. So it sounds paradoxical when we say it, but we've gotten so used to saying it, at least in our Christian culture, that we don't think twice about it anymore. But Trinitarian doctrine came out of Nicaea. Who commits the error of Arianism today, or as the series says, the error of Thor? That would be the Jehovah's Witnesses, primarily. Oh my goodness. Started writing Jeremiah. There you go. Jehovah's Witnesses. So the Jehovah's Witnesses are the primary people of today. I have some quotes in there in the study guide you'll see, but they clearly state that Christ is a created being. He's the first of all creation. And as we get into their Christology, what they argue is that the Archangel Michael became Jesus, and after his resurrection, he returned to his role and position as Archangel Michael. How they got to that point, I'm not entirely sure. But from their own websites, from their own literature and stuff like that, they are certified Arians, without a doubt. Another group that's not listed in our study guide, that has elements, or at least has the idea of Arianism, if not outright Arianism, is the Mormons, the LDS. Because they think that really it's very cyclical, that everything is being created and created again and created again. That at one point God the Father was just a human on another planet who was the son of a mother and a father who came into existence and raised to the level of godhood, and then birthed his own world, and that we are the progenitors of him birthing us into the world. So there's a repetition of creation. So you kind of get towards that. In the end, what it is saying that there was a time that God as we know him did not exist, right? So both of these, both the Arian position and arguably the LDS position, assume that time has been eternally existent. But even physics says that time had a beginning, that we can go back far enough that time didn't exist as we follow the physics models backwards. That time is an element, the passage of time is an element of light and gravity working together. It's kind of a fun thing. So, but who commits it today? Primarily the Jehovah's Witnesses, right? And then to a degree, the LDS Mormons, right? And we'll talk about them a little bit more later. They are unique in themselves because they kind of pull from lots of different baskets and they create something entirely new. But as close today as a position of Arianism is the Jehovah's Witnesses, with some other interesting choices of social behavior. So that's where we ended last week, right? So let's pick up then. What does the Bible say about all this? So let's go with John 1 through 14. Go ahead and turn there. You can go ahead and put your thumb or finger or a note card or something at Colossians chapter 1, because we're going to need to go there as well. John 1:1 begins, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning." That's the way the John 1:1 starts out, correct? He was in the beginning with God. So here's an interesting thing. If I take the Greek that John provided and that John wrote in for this gospel, and we translate it word for word, this is what it comes out as. In ancient times was the Word, and the Word was with the God, and God was the Word. He was in ancient times with the God. So NRK, hey halagos, kai halagos, hey. Anyway, we don't need to read the Greek. But anyways, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And what's funny is that third phrase, it says, and the Word was God, right? So that's the interesting phrase. And there's something, the way that the construction is. When you're talking about the construction of that particular sentence, it specifically says and, so that's your conjunction. So that's really not part of the sentence, it just combines sentences, right? You have theos, God. That's in the subject form, the nominative form. So if I would say, I threw the ball, who's the subject? I, right? So an I is the nominative form of first person pronoun I, right? If I say Billy threw the ball, Billy's the subject. Billy's in the nominative case. So, but now here we say God was the Word. The form of God, theos, is the dictionary or lexical form of the word. God is the nominative. But so is logos. But only one of those two words has the definite article. If I say definite article, what's a definite article? To define something. Those who are fans of Ohio State make use of this all the time. They're not alum of Ohio State. They're alum of the Ohio State, right? So, and then we say, what's John 14:6 say? Does it say, I am a way, a truth, and a life? It says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Those are definite articles. Anytime you use the word the or the when we're saying it, it's a definite article. We are identifying a singular thing as definitely pointing to this thing. Usually in Greek construction, whichever word has the definite article, especially when you have a be verb in between, was is a form of be. It's just the past tense of be, right? So whichever word has the article, the definite article, is usually the subject, even though it sometimes leads with the predicate nominative. So it's saying God was the Word. So in English, we would translate it so it sounds correct to us. It's that the Word was God, which is why we flip it around. But why would you put the predicate, the end of the sentence, at the beginning? Because you're wanting to emphasize it. I want to emphasize that God and the Word are the same. This is what John's trying to do. But because God does not have an article at all, it's just not one there, the Jehovah's Witnesses, when they translate their version of the Bible, will say the Word was a God. Which any linguistic translator of the Scriptures will say it's just a very, very poor, not even poor, it's just a horrendous translation. There's no conceivable argument to provide the indefinite article a or an in front of God at that point, right? Especially when you take it in context. Because what happens in verse 14 of John chapter 1? What does it say about the word, the logos, the word? He became flesh. Okay, so now we know whatever this logos is that John is talking about, this logos became flesh. And who is the subject of all of John's writings? In all 5 of his books, it's Jesus Christ. So there's an equation of logos to Jesus. There's a clear equation to here. But John says that this logos was in the beginning with God. And that this logos was with God, and this logos was God. So The existence of God. Okay, so the first one is logos. I'm just going to write it this way. Logos. And so logos means what? It means word, correct? Yes. Logos means word. So in a very literal sense, pew, P-E-W, what you're sitting on, is a word. Pew is a word. So in Greek, the term pew would be a logos. It is a word, right? So in a very literal sense, it's talking about some putting a handful of phonemes together to create a sound that becomes a word that is a logos, right? In a philosophical sense, logos was also the personification of God's existence. The word existed in the beginning and was used with God. So within contemporary Jewish writing, even with John and before John, and specifically with a gentleman named Philo. Philo is a Jewish philosopher contemporary to the first century, and really just slightly before. But he used consistently, and this influenced the way the rest of Jewish academia, if you will, used the term logos. So it had a widespread contemporary use of this logos concept was an independent personification of God. Help me define personification. If something personifies, what does it do? No, it doesn't make it bigger. Imitates or shows, demonstrates, exemplifies, right? That it makes a concept tangible, right? So if Jesus is the personification of God, that's why Jesus said, when the disciples asked him, just show us the Father. And he says, have I not been with you so long? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. That Jesus is the personification of God, right? And so that when, in a philosophical sense, used by Philo and other contemporaries of this first BC and first AD 1, the use of logos was also used as a descriptor of the personification of God showing himself to us, that he is the Word made flesh, and this is why John starts to use this word over and over, because it was an understood philosophical term, and he was connecting this personification of God in logos with Jesus Christ and trying to combine those terms, and he does so successfully. Hold your finger there, John 1, but turn way to the end of your New Testament, 1 John 1:1. So if you find Revelation, turn back 3 books, and you get John chapter 1, verse 1. 1 John chapter 1, verse 1. 1 John, same author, chapter 1, verse 1. He writes, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon and have touched with our hands concerning the word of life. The logos of Zeo, I bet you it's a form of Zoe. I should have looked this one up. Sorry, this one's off the cuff. From the word of life to lagu tes zoes, the word of life. I was right. Haha, fun. So that consistently John uses logos to describe Jesus. He does so again. If you want to write down another one, we're not going to take time to look at it today. But Revelation 19:13 also uses, John is referring to Jesus as Logos again. So it's a consistent use within the Johannine literature, the writings of John, but it's also a consistent use of Logos in the philosophical realm, in the academic writing contemporary to John, to use the term Logos as a personification of God acting in our time and space, in our reality, that it is God making himself known.
So that was before Christ came?
Philo?
Yes.
Philo was about a century before.
And he made it that the word means God?
He, in a philosophical sense, he was saying that the use, he created, or he was one of the folks that used, I wouldn't say he created and coined it, but that he used the term Logos as in a technical way to say this is how God presents himself, in a personification of God, that God making himself known to us.
Because they were using like the Old Testament by using that?
That, and they were using Greek. So he definitely wrote in Greek, Philo did. And so you have the idea, because Greek philosophy was huge and very influential. Who were the Jews that, I'm going to get to your question, but let's lead into it a little bit. Who were the Jews, among the Jews of even Jesus' day, there was a group of Jews that were more Greek than they were Jewish. They claimed Jewish ethnicity, but they lived in a culture that was more Greek. What were they called? Say again? No, not the Pharisees. Pharisees were teachers. They were just teachers, right? Say again? Hellenists, yes. The Hellenistic Jews. Hella, so I mean, even Greece today is called Helena, right? So they were the Hellenistic Jews, right? And so it comes out of the story of Troy. So they named themselves after this woman named Helen. But Hellenistic Jews, so you got these Hellenistic Jews. And they were greatly influenced by the Greek culture. So you had this Greek philosophy that was starting to syncretize with Jewish thought. All right? And one of the great examples of that is Mr. Philo. So just like we have technical terms today that we use in various ways, when we, like in literature, here's an example, and I need to move on after this. In literature, when we talk about a passage or a paragraph, a section and a selection of a piece of writing from a larger group, right? So it's a paragraph out of a chapter. And all I want to concentrate on that one paragraph. There's a technical term for that paragraph when I extract it out. It starts with a P. Anybody know what it is? Pericope. I like it because it's just kind of fun. It's spelled like pericope. But it's a pericope. It is a technical term for a selected passage. It can be used in any literature study. However, it's typically only used when talking about pulling a passage of scripture out, and it's usually only used by theologians, right? And so it's a technical term that it could be used elsewhere, but it's usually only used in the realm of pastors, teachers, and theologians. And logos took on a technical meaning during this time period. So, with that, let's go to the third phrase. What was the third phrase of John 1:1? The Word was God, right? So I'm assuming that all the English translations that we have in front of us for our group today, yours says the Word was God, right? Even whether it's King James, English Standard, NIV, NASB, whichever version you have in front of you, they all say the Word was God, correct? All right. So we have scholars upon scholars upon scholars that say that this is the proper construction in the English, not even though the Greek says God was the Word, right? The construction in Greek is inverted. But because the word has the article, it's really the subject, and that God is at the beginning of the sentence to emphasize, hey, I'm really saying that the word is God, right? So let's talk about the was very briefly. Was is what kind of verb? What's its base? What's the base word? If we look up was in the dictionary, what word would we actually look for? To be, right? It is a form of to be. It's equative. If it is saying that A is B, right, or Z is W, it equates that apples are oranges. They're really not, but it's an equation. So it is saying that part one is the same as part two, right? So we've talked about this before. Greek has different senses of time in its language that English doesn't have. They do verbs a little bit differently, because sometimes they'll do they'll take a verb and it conjugates and it goes to a certain conjugation. It's talking about where in time it happens. It's not only that it happened in the past, but it happened in the past and has continuing effects into the future, right? Or sometimes it's completely in the past. We're talking about holistically that it is a past event. That it may have continuing effects, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying something happened in the past. They have a future tense, they have a continuing, so they have those things. So how is be being used here? It's pretty fun. So it has an aspect, has an internal aspect that it says it just is. Without regard to time, without regarding a passage of time, it just is. That God is Word. Word is God. Despite time. There's no inclination or there's no declaration of time. He just is. It's without regard to time. So when we come back to the first phrase, in the beginning was the Word. Where does beginning happen? In the beginning, right? So John has an understanding of time, right? But he's saying, in the beginning was the Word. That the Word was in the beginning. What was before the beginning? If we were to say that anything was before the beginning, we would be mistaken in the sense that we were saying that time existed already. But we can't describe an existence outside of time because that's all we know. Here's where we get to the philosophy aspect, right? So in the beginning, if Christ was in the beginning, the Word was in the beginning, the Word was with God, and the Word was God. We closed last session that, how do we say that the Word was with God and the Word was God at the same time? And this is how we get into the personae, the persons of the Trinity, right? That He was present. But when we say the Word was God, there's no indication of time within that word. It's called internal aspect. But it's also a stative active. That the subject exists, it indicates the state of the verb. In other words, that the word, in its stative, in its situational existence, is God. He's saying it equates. It's the same thing as we're saying one is one or two is two. We use phrases like that, and we use the antithesis to that, saying we can't compare apples to oranges because they're not the same. We must compare apples to apples, right? So this is the same idea that John's getting after, that when he compares apples to apples, the Word is God, right? Okay, so that's the was. So back to our, here the black text says, the Word existed before time. How can you be in the beginning if you didn't already exist? He was in the beginning. The Word existed before time. What was before time? we can't say. We don't have the language to say what was before time because we exist in time. Everything we say that exists somewhere in time. The fact that it exists, all that we see and don't see. What does the confession say? Make sure I get it right. It says, I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and of all things visible and invisible. That anything that we know as existence is bound within time. But if the Word existed before time, it just was. It just is. The Word existed with no bound to time. That time itself, the passage of time, is part of creation. Sir, go ahead.
So the equivalent in the Hebrew, which was very important to the Hebrews, God says when Moses says, well, who do I say? He just says, I am.
Mm-hmm.
Which means the self-existent one. To exist. I am is part of the to be verb.
Correct.
But that's in the Hebrew sense and the great I am.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. So when God says, I am, I just am. Well, what are you? I am. Right? I exist. I self-exist. Remember the fancy short word we had for self-existence starts with an A? Aseity, right? The self-existence of God, right? So, and the fact that God, when he makes his creation, ex nihilo, he creates out of nothing. Everything that exists is out of nothing. It's not that God wasn't something, but God, all of creation that we know is the something, and God created the something, and we are part of the something. So everything that we see and don't see, everything visible and invisible, is a creation of God through the Word, as we get into Colossians 1. Okay, so before the Word existed, before time, the Word was, the Word just is, that God says, I am. So all things were created through the Word. John chapter 1, verse 3, how is the Word begotten? I mean, how is the Word described? Darn it. What is the term used? It says begotten, does it not? John chapter 1, verse 3. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was. Oh, my bad. Hold on here. Why did I write John 1:3 here? Verse what? 1:14? Oh, okay, yeah, you're right. Okay. Yeah, I've got a typo here. So let's change it out. Let's scratch out the 1:3. I don't know what was going on there. It is 1:14. All right. It also shows up in John 3:16, which is very familiar to all of us. But the term here, only begotten. So in the English Standard Version, it says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory as of the only Son from the Father." The King James would say, "the only begotten of the Father." Does anybody else have something variant to only son of or only begotten? Is there another variant in your translations? It shouldn't be, right? So the term used here yeah, that works. So is monogenes. And it means only begotten. It's a declaration. It comes from a verb called genesios, and it's one that is and it's used of children. It's a legitimacy. It's the legitimacy of someone that's a member of the family, right? In the ancient world, was every child of a person a legitimate child of the family? Was every biological born child a legitimate member of the family? Yes, no? No. Because we're talking a legal sense here. Can they inherit property? Can they inherit anything from their parents? Not unless they're legitimate. Recognized, declared, this is my child, right? Which is why you had people like Julius Caesar who had legitimate children with his wife and had lots of illegitimate children with other women. But none of those illegitimate children would ever receive any inheritance from Julius Caesar, right? Or any other of the ancient leaders or oligarchs or wealthy individuals after that. So who received the senior blessing out of Jacob? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Who received the senior blessing out of Jacob? Judah. Why Judah? I think it's a bit arguable between Judah and Joseph, because Joseph received a double blessing, because the blessing went to both boys, to the grandsons, who Jacob took on as his sons. But I would also argue that Judah is the one that got the premier blessing, and why? Right, so those were disqualified with that, because who was the actual biologically firstborn child? Reuben, right? Reuben did not get it. Well, out of protection of his sister, he still committed murder, right? So, but Judah got it. He was named, the scepter will not depart from your feet. That out of his line will become the kings, the rulers of the progenation. That is out of the tribe of Judah that we have the great king, King David, and Solomon that comes after him, and then the kingdom splits after that because of knuckleheads, right? So Judah is the monogenes. He is the unique inheritor. So it's a title. Was Isaac Abraham's first son? No, Ishmael was his first son. But if you turn over here to page 5, I have Hebrews chapter 9 listed. Hebrews chapter 10 listed here. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Consequently, when Christ came into the world, he says, "Sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me." This is the wrong text. I'm sorry, Hebrews 11, verse 17. I apologize. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promise was in the act of offering up his only son. The writer of Hebrews says that Isaac was Abraham's only son. Is that literally true? No, he had Ishmael, right? But only son, the term here is monogenes, his only begotten son. It is a title. It is set aside as, this is the inheritor of all that is mine. It is a title. So when God says, "In you I'm well pleased, today I have begotten you," it is a title. It is a technical term. Just like logos has a literal and a technical sense, monogenes has a literal and a technical sense, and is being used in a technical sense here in the scriptures. So Colossians 1, and we'll have to close with this. Colossians 1, go ahead and turn to Colossians 1, verse 15. Are we keeping up so far? Are we okay? Not totally? Okay, good. Colossians 1, verse 15. This is the 15 to 20 is the great passage we turn to when we're talking about the preeminence of Christ. That Christ is the first. Christ is above all. That he is responsible for all. We pick up key words that all of creation is made by him, through him, and for him. But in Colossians 1:15, and this is where our Jehovah's Witnesses and we will understand the term differently. Colossians 1:15 says, he is the image of the invisible God. Who's the he? It's Jesus, right? Jesus is the image of the invisible God. He is the Logos. He is the personification. He is making God the Father visible. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. Now, so far I've been arguing that Christ is not born. He is not created. But now Paul himself is calling Jesus the firstborn. How do I understand this? No, we can't. We got to be careful. We don't want to say that, right? Because then we start getting into the Arian argument, right? That there's a sense that he was created. When we describe Jesus coming into the flesh, he clothed himself. He added flesh and bone to his nature, right? He was born into existence as human, so he's completely human, and everything that we experience as human in our development, he experienced, from being the little zygote all the way through everything else, that he is human, right? But we say that he added humanity to his existence, right? So, but he is the firstborn of all creation. We come back to this idea of monogenes, that he is the only begotten. It's a title. So these, for firstborn and only begotten, become synonymous terms, very similar terms. Because it's prototokos. Prototokos. It's having a special status associated with the firstborn. It's a figurative firstborn. It's a title. It's a declaration. Judah became the prototokos. He became the firstborn because he received the blessing of leadership, of authority that went out of Jacob. Sir.
So, if I get this clearly,
Please,
we're trying to get
help
it
me out.
clear, and I'm going to repeat kind of what you're saying.
Yes, sir.
The word firstborn here is not a description, but a title.
Correct.
So it is not a description, like we would simply say someone who was born first.
Correct.
It is a title like you say.
So let me use your family. Your family is actually, no, y'all aren't. That doesn't really work. For the sake of the argument, I'm going to flip your ages, okay? I'm going to make you older, okay? I know you're 11 months younger, but I'm going to make you older for just a moment, okay? So if I use the Amin children as an example, and we say that Leanne is the one that's 15, is 15 years old, and Lee is 14 years old, and we go back to ancient times of the ancient Near East, is Leanne the firstborn? Is she the prototokos? Even though she's physically the firstborn? No, the firstborn goes to the senior male heir, right? So even if Leanne is older than Lee is still considered the firstborn, even though biologically she's older. All right? I know that's inverted, but go with me for the sake of descriptions. Now, let's use my family. Would Kira be considered my firstborn? Yes, because I have no male children. We just talked about female inheritance in the book of Numbers, right? Right. So we just had that discussion. We just had that study. So even those daughters, and probably the senior of the daughters, was the prototokos, the firstborn, right? Because that's the person that inherited to maintain that family integrity. It's pretty cool, right? So we get that. So Jesus is declared firstborn, and it's an indicative of rank and of supremacy. This is a typical use of Greco-Roman word. It is used repeatedly in What's the LXX or the Septuagint? When we talk about firstborns in the Septuagint, what is the Septuagint? Or Septuagint? We just talked about this one in the Wednesday study. The Greek copy of the Old Testament, right? It's the Greek translation of the Old Testament, right? And so when you're talking about firstborns in the Old Testament, and this is the term they use, prototokos, the one who receives the inheritance that carries on the family line, right? So was Esau, and last thing, was Esau or Jacob older? Esau was older. Physically the firstborn of Isaac. But who was the firstborn in inheritance? It was Jacob. Jacob is the prototokos, even though he is second-born. All right? So why is it important? Nothing in creation can save us. Only the Creator can save us. We as humanity broke His law. We broke His moral code. And only He can give us the grace and the justification to give us salvation. So that which was from the beginning, that which was with God and was God from the beginning, that became man, was flesh, the Logos became flesh and dwelt among us. Only that which was from all eternity coming into time to be living among us can save us. This is why the Arian argument is wrong. Because if Arius was correct, Jesus is created. Jesus is part of creation, and nothing from creation can save us. Hebrews 9 says, it's the blood of bulls and goats and the sprinkling of defiled persons, of ashes and heifers. If they could sanctify you, we would all be saved. How much more, though, the blood of Christ, through whom the eternal Spirit offered up himself without blemish to God. That it took God from all eternity, outside of time, outside of space, coming into our time and space to redeem us. This is why it's important that we understand who Jesus is and why we will argue that Arius was wrong. And this is why I would say that the Jehovah's Witnesses, and to a degree in how they agree with Arius, this is how the LDS are also incorrect in their understanding, and therefore they teach a false gospel. Colossians 1:16 is that we are created by Him, through Him, and for the Son. And the Lord of the universe is the Lord of the church. And this is the whole point of Colossians 1:17 through 20. We're going to close here because we're out of time. But you can look at the definition of confession down at the bottom. This is why we do this. Our confession and what we say, what we believe is important. And there's 3 reasons for confession. It's at the bottom of your study guide on page 5. But with that, let's go ahead and take a break. We'll come back for service. And David, I apologize for going over. So, way over, I apologize. So let's go ahead and break.